Hello and welcome, and thank you for coming to our session. We are pleased to present Flexible Learning and Development for the Frontline with our partner eduMe and its customer APC Overnight. My name is Fonda Chang, and I'm a Senior Partner Alliances Manager at Beekeeper. Not only do I have the pleasure of being your host today, but also introducing the guest speakers for our session. First, I'd like to welcome Corina Forman. She is the HR Director of the APC, which is the UK's largest independent parcel delivery network. Corina has over 30 years experience in HR and is committed to creating a work culture that differentiates the APC to attract and nurture talent in a fast-growing and rapidly evolving industry. Corina began her HR career in the retail sector, and in 2013, she joined Gordon Dad's Consulting as the HR Director. The merger and acquisition work in this role developed Corina's interest in the importance of culture and talent management. This year, Corina completed a degree in organizational and business psychology. Through her studies, she developed a keen interest in the tools and techniques that HR teams can use to optimize workplace cultures, build workforce resilience, and improve organizational agility. When Corina isn't working, she likes to spend her free time hiking, especially if there is somewhere to enjoy a good lunch along the way. And next, I'd like to introduce Jacob Waern. Jacob began his career in 2005 with the European media company Modern Times Group. He quickly rose to CEO of one of its larger subsidiaries. Since then, Jacob has cemented his mark in the world of technology as a co-founder of Rocket Internet, a company that incubates, builds, and develops global internet and tech companies. He was also the digital ventures director at Millicom, an international telecommunications and media company. During his time at Millicom, the idea for eduMe was born out of his collective experiences observing the difficulties in training globally dispersed deskless teams. As founder and CEO of eduMe, Jacob oversees the company's mission to provide the frontline workforce with seamless access to relevant knowledge and enable people to be successful at work. And if all that doesn't sound challenging enough for Jacob, he is also the father of 3 girls, ages 10, 8, and 4. So welcome, Corina and Jacob. We're so glad you could join us today. Let's take a look at what we'll be covering. So our session will be focused around flexible learning and development for the frontline. First, we'll examine the current state of what deskless workers expect from their employers. Then we'll take a deeper dive into 2 other subjects, how L&D impacts onboarding and productivity, and safety and compliance. And as we wrap up, we'll have an open question and answer session. So let's get to our first topic, and I'll start with Jacob for his insights. So Jacob, I know that eduMe is obsessed with understanding frontline workers, what makes them tick, and how companies can better serve them. Recently, eduMe published some research on these topics. So tell us, what were some of your key findings on deskless workers' expectations?
Thank you, Fonda. Indeed, we are obsessed, and I'm obsessed with it. We don't know nearly, I think as an industry, we don't know nearly as much as we should about the deskless workforce, given that they make up a staggering 80% of the global workforce. In our 2022 report, we set out to identify what motivates deskless workers, whether they feel loyal to companies they work for, whether they feel safe at work, and how they're being communicated with. And one of our key findings from this report was that there's a large informational disconnect between the HQ and the frontline worker. And this is partly because companies are using no tech solution or legacy tech. And we found that 61% rely on face-to-face sessions, and only 8% are using fully integrated seamless training, which is what we do. And these things are not scalable. And for the worker, it's failing to meet fundamental need. 3/4 of workers said they aren't administered with the skills training they need to perform better, although more than 80% want that information. And this is then having onward implications on things like performance, productivity, onboarding, retention, and the state of safety and compliance. So some of these things we'll discuss today.
Got it. Wow. Okay. So those are some surprising statistics. And I heard you mention retention, right? And we've been talking so much about the Great Resignation for the past 2 years. Could you share what you think drove that moment and whether or not we're past it?
Yeah, sure. So I think a lot of people think that this is a new occurrence, but the Great Resignation is something that's been brewing since before the pandemic. And for a number of years, it is a more of a long-term trend. And we're just witnessing the continuation of that trend. In our study, we found that over 50% of deskless workers felt no loyalty to their employer. However, and the good news is that attrition is not an inevitability and that people can be swayed. Another widely cited study actually shows that 50% of attrition is completely avoidable. And there are some ways that you can address that we know about already. They include investing in learning and development. Over a third of surveyed workers would feel more connection to a company that offered them additional information on how to do their job better. Empowering people with a voice. 44% in the study said they'd feel a greater connection if they were empowered with a voice, i.e. they were asked for feedback. And so they feel part of what they're doing. At the moment, this is definitely an area for improvement. So it's interesting that 80% of companies in the survey say they're collecting feedback and checking in with workers, how they're feeling. 63% of workers said they're not doing this. So there is a fairly big disconnect there. And a separate study shows that people are likely to perform 5 times better when they feel listened to. Also, delivery is really important. So empowering people with a voice, investing in training, that's all well and good, but only if you implement it in a way that's conducive to the worker experience and productivity. So it needs to be simple, easy to access in it, and they need to be engaging.
Wow. Imagine the impact organizations would see if they could get the right training to frontline workers so they could do their jobs better. And Corina, I'm interested in hearing your perspective as well. What has your experience been? Are you seeing a shift in employee attitudes to be more value-driven and not fearing to leave companies that don't meet their training needs?
Yes, absolutely. I've worked in HR for almost 30 years and I've seen huge changes in employees' expectations of the workplace and their willingness to move on if those expectations are not met. So, for example, inclusion and diversity, mental health and well-being, support, the expectation of continuous learning and development, clear action and messaging on things like corporate social responsibility and sound business ethics. These are all areas where employees want to see strong commitment from their employers. And of course, the problem for frontline workers is that they typically have much less exposure to all the communication and training interventions, which tend to focus on these types of areas. And of course, where training is undertaken, the priority is often to address some of those statutory training requirements. And this can leave a void in the values-based learning and communication, which is actually very important to today's employees. But I think it's also very important for organisations because really it's a company's positioning on the values-based criteria that is often its key differentiator from competitors operating in the same sector. And so if you're unable to communicate with your frontline workers, then you're less able to effectively shape the culture, values and beliefs of your organisation. And then what you end up with really is that situation where the reality on the ground doesn't match the written mission statement and policies and procedures that you've got in the employee handbook.
Goodness. It sounds like the frontline workers are digitally underserved. And how would you say your particular industry is being impacted by the lack of digitization?
Really interesting question, Fonda. I attended a Logistics UK conference earlier this year, and some common themes emerged in relation to challenges with recruitment, retention, engagement, and the increasing rates of mental and physical health problems in the workplace. And of course, the difficulty is how we address those challenges across a population that not only comprises the greatest proportion of our workforce, but is also the most difficult to reach because they're working a variety of shift patterns and are often mobile or working across multiple sites. The other constraint is that we're operating in a sector where customer expectations are constantly growing and evolving, but market consolidation consolidation and competition has driven down profit margins, there's a kind of expectation that delivery should be free. So my experience aligns very much with the research findings that were outlined by Jacob, and conventional digital learning and engagement solutions are just not well suited to the needs of workers in this sector, who are then at risk of being excluded from the learning and development opportunities that are available to their desk-based colleagues. And there's a risk really that this lack of access to learning and engagement interventions is simply compounding the challenges that the sector already faces. So I guess in summary, I would say that the lack of digitisation is potentially hindering organisations from both tackling some of the very pressing issues they now face, as well as impeding the development of those kind of high performance cultures, that kind of engagement, innovation and agility that really enables your business to respond effectively to change.
Wow, that is fantastic. Thanks for sharing that with us, Corina. And that actually brings us to our next topic, which is onboarding and productivity. Now, onboarding seems to be an eternal pain point when trying to get new employees productive faster. From your perspective, Jacob, why is this? Why do companies struggle so much with effective onboarding?
Yeah, this is really interesting. It's at the heart of what we do and where we started, the first use case that eduMe started with. Onboarding is a very important moment in the employee life cycle. As a company, you're setting the expectations of yourself and how you differentiate yourself as an employer. 20% of individuals joining company will leave within just 45 days if onboarding is inadequate, which is really quite unacceptable because it's definitely something within the control of the employer many times. And so we've found that frontline workers are in this area dissatisfied on two fronts. One is speed. So from our survey, 72% said it should have been faster. And quality, 90% said the experience could be improved. Now, how to proceed with this requires some reflection from companies about how they treat onboarding. What's their current process like? What can they do to make the experience better? Is it about adding more human touch to things, communicating vision and mission better? Or is it, and also it's worthwhile thinking about things one step earlier at the pre-boarding stage. So we know in the retail industry, for example, and it might be interesting to hear from the audience, their experiences, 20% of people in retail don't even show up for their first shift. So there's a lot you can do at a really early stage. Some concrete tips include stripping things back to the basics. So communicate what people need to succeed on day one and try to stick to this only so as to avoid information overload. Then over time, you can continue to follow up with additional knowledge, and you can do that around triggers based on time or evolution in that role. So it makes it more relevant. Secondly, use engaging formats like video that show people how to do things themselves. It's a proven method that resonates more with learners or workers. 3, make sure to emphasize your competitive differentiators. How do you stand out? What do you do? Why are you better? This is highly motivating to people to understand what does the company stand for that I'm about to join. And lastly, and harking back a little bit to what we said before, reduce that digital friction. You can't help people if they struggle to access material in the first place. So the impact of doing all this longer term retention, 70% of frontline workers will stay for 3 or more years if onboarding is executed and in line with the need. So massive potential there.
Gosh, as I listen to you speak, I'm just thinking about the massive cost savings that are involved with being able to retain those employees. So those are some great tips. Now, Jacob, what metrics would you use to demonstrate successful onboarding and engaged employees?
Yeah, so metrics will be unique to an extent and vary based on factors like what industry are you in, what do the company needs. For instance, a factor like time to productivity might be closely scrutinized for on-demand or gig companies that we work with, but retail might look at sales per employee. Speaking generally, you can look at the quantitative side, lesson completion rates. If people complete something, that's more likely to drive the efficacy. So how engaged are people? how well was the training received. You can look at NPS results or similar methods. You can look at how quickly people are making a difference, how many shifts perhaps they're completing, their customer rating, how little or how much they need to lean on the support team. All of these things we've seen. And then ultimately, what we just discussed around retention, how many people are staying or leaving, what's your new employee turnover rate. So if you nail the onboarding, much more likely to hold on to people. On the qualitative side, you can look at individual survey responses to open text questions gathered during and at the end of onboarding. So you're giving them a voice and then you're doing something around that feedback. And of course, ideally, you want to do both. A bit of quant, a bit of qual.
Yeah. That's a great mix of both the qualitative and the quantitative. And it sounds like our audience should be able to use any of those just to make sure that they're staying on track. All right. I want to turn the conversation to Corina, because I'm sure you've seen your fair share of onboarding challenges with frontline workers in both your past and your current roles. What kind of training have you offered with the intent of improving engagement, productivity, or internal processes?
We recognise that while many people want secure employment, many others do like the flexibility and freedom that working through a temporary agency can provide. So we've structured our eduMe training courses, providing content for both our employed colleagues working across different departments, so the content is always relevant to their needs, whilst also tailoring content for our agency colleagues. And that's through a QR code, which allows them to swipe and then immediately access learning content that's relevant to them. I have to say, we've been absolutely overwhelmed actually by the level of agency worker engagement that we've seen. So to put that into context, we typically have 100 to 150 agency workers on site each evening, but we've got 410 that are actively engaging with our content online, which is good. Obviously, given our operating environment, we've written a lot of content covering health and safety. And during the pandemic, when guidelines were constantly changing, it was fantastic that we could change processes and then disseminate learning content across our workforce instantaneously. And importantly, we could then track the engagement with that content. We've also delivered a significant amount of content in the whole health and wellbeing space. So lots of material on mental health, physical health, cardiovascular disease, even gambling, cancer awareness, loneliness, all that kind of area. And we really use these sessions to communicate our values of care and respect, but also so that we can be directing people in need to the kind of internal and also the external resources of support that they perhaps need to access. We also use eduMe to celebrate success. For example, APC was recently very proud to launch our first Warehouse to Wheels training program. And we had our first female colleague progress from working in the warehouse to becoming a HGV driver. And so to communicate that kind of success is fantastic. And then also to communicate on other values. So, for example, we do a lot of fundraising for Promise Dreams, which is a charity for terminally ill children. And we find that our employees engage a lot with that kind of content as well.
Wow. I love that the approaches that you have take into consideration a person as a whole and not just looking at them from one single aspect as an employee. So I'm curious to know what impact you have seen on engagement and performance as a result of these offerings.
Our operations are obviously very complex, and multiple factors can impact upon engagement and performance. But we are definitely seeing some very interesting correlations, which I'm very happy to share with you. For example, we've seen a marked increase in our retention rates. Just 6 months ago, our analysis showed that 74% of our warehouse night operations colleagues had more than 1 year's service with us. We looked at this figure again just last week, and that figure is now 79%. So that's a 5% improvement, which I think is really good, especially considering the very transitory nature of hourly paid night working. We've also seen a steady improvement in productivity by 2 points. And again, that's worth circa 100K per month to us as a business. So that's a really positive result. And then another really key example is a sort of steady year-on-year decrease of 20% in the number of accidents and incidents which take place. So overall, some key metrics are all going in the right direction. And what we're really seeing is that's correlating with a continued increase in eduMe engagement month on month in our employed and agency colleagues.
Wow, those are some incredible results. So thank you so much again for sharing those with us. I can't believe that we're already at our final topic, right? And this one is safety and compliance for the frontline workforce. Now, again, I'm going to start with Jacob. And I found out another interesting item from the eduMe study was that 68% of workers said they did not regularly participate in health and safety training. That's well over half of the respondents, right, in the survey. And we all recognize safety and compliance is so critical, but often treated like an afterthought. Why do you feel it is so important to shift this attitude?
Yeah, firstly, because it has such a direct impact, direct personal impact on people's health. You have wagelessness, inability to return to work, the psychological impact, and so on and so forth. We found that 73% regard workplace safety as important in their job. And of course, as employers, we will have a duty of care to our workforce. Secondly, because it's really costly. The average cost of non-compliance in the US is around $14-15 million per company, which is also much higher than it was 10 years ago. In contrast, it will cost you nearly 3 times less to address compliance in the first place. So you can really be preemptive and proactive here. And those costs are made up of time away from work, legal and reputational costs, workers quitting because of an unsafe environment, repercussions on brand reputation, and potential inability to attract people to the company on account of that. So conversely, the impact of doing this type of training can be huge, which is nicely exemplified both by what Corina has just shared, case in point. Another client success story we have with a big logistics company in North America, where they managed to reduce injuries by 26%, and Corina just mentioned 20%. This is a marked improvement.
Wow. You know, I think everybody recognizes that the inability to have a strong compliance practice is definitely costly, but you had brought up some of the other impacts that can harm your business. And so that's great to bring that kind of awareness. And I'm interested in hearing, flipping the sides now and hearing Corina's perspective. You know, when companies prioritize and invest in safety and compliance, it seems like only half the challenge is tackled. And I feel like I've heard that the other half is the workers' perceptions and attitudes towards safety and compliance. We hear it all the time. Oh, the training is boring. It's such a chore to complete. How do we get learners to see this training in a different light and find enjoyment in traditionally dense content?
So I think this is where organizationally you need to create a culture that really emphasizes and prioritizes health and safety. So we've used eduMe to strongly support and promote this culture by delivering lots of content in short lessons, which perhaps just take 2 to 3 minutes, but enforce the key learning points. So what our frontline workers experience is a constant drip of positive health and safety learning content. We also use the whole range of eduMe formats to keep the learning really fresh and fun, but while still imparting those serious sound bites of learning, and always underpinned by that culture of care and respect. So, for example, we'll send out regular communications on health and safety, but then those will be interspersed with sessions based on the more traditional lesson format, and then also the conversational discussion formats that you can design within eduMe to introduce a lighter, more fun element to the training as well. So that kind of interspersing lots of different formats and filtering it out as a constant drip seems to be working really well for us.
That is a great overall approach, right, to safety and compliance training, which leads me to 2 follow-up questions. How do you curate your topics? And if you see lower completion rates than desired, how do you follow up?
So for us, Business data metrics are the main driver of all of our training content. As a business, we review all of our KPIs on a daily basis. So things like productivity, absence rates, accident trends, and customer service performance metrics. What this means is that if we spot any kind of emerging trend, then we can develop eduMe content very quickly to address what we're seeing. For example, if we saw 2 accidents in a month where people have been hit by a falling box from a cage, then we'll prepare and disseminate a lesson to remind people of the correct cage opening process. We've also have the whole HR and line management teams engaged in developing ideas for eduMe content. So, for example, our transport team at the moment are currently working very closely with us to develop content around safe driving, which is obviously very topical in the UK as we move into the winter months. Mm-hmm. Finally, we also look out for hot topics and news items for inspiration. And so that's where things like sometimes the cancer, diabetes, or mental health awareness weeks might come into play. And also, for example, as we're seeing at the moment, the cost of living crisis is in the headlines a lot. And so that's prompted us to design and deliver content on financial coping strategies and resources that our people can go to for support. In terms of the second part of your question, we have put in place weekly and monthly eduMe engagement reporting, which keeps the topic very firmly on the business agenda, but also allows our HR managers to review eduMe progress stats with the line managers that they're supporting. But what I would emphasise is launching eduMe is very much a journey for us. And so the next stage for us now is to look at how we can achieve fuller integration with some of our other internal processes. For example, ensuring that eduMe engagement is perhaps discussed as part of the annual performance review process, or including it as an assessment criteria for those seeking internal promotion.
Again, Corina, those are great approaches. And I can't believe that wraps up the topics that we had planned for our session. And so, again, I'd like to thank Jacob and Corina for helping us lead this thought-provoking discussion. And we hope our audience found their time well spent. Given these key takeaways, we hope that you'll be wanting to share with your organization. First of all, plain and simple, workers want training. Right? They're asking for it and they want it delivered in a technologically forward way. Failure to meet this fundamental need will affect retention and also workforce productivity. Next, accessibility is everything. First, make sure you're delivering training to workers where and when it's convenient for them and on devices they're using. Until this first step is met, it won't matter how incredibly engaging your content is. And finally, focus on formats. For example, the use of microlearning coupled with videos or gamified learning can turn mundane health and safety training into something engaging. When learners willingly complete and remember training, they promote greater compliance within the organization. Okay, I tell you what, audience, it is time to hear from you. So we are going to open our Q&A session. And this is my favorite part. So let me see which one we've got. Okay, this one will be for Jacob. Beyond training and employee voice, right? I guess this means giving the employees a chance to express their voice. What other things did workers mention in your report that would increase their company loyalty?
Yeah, sure. Happy to answer that one. A couple of things that came out here. Rewards program was something that was specifically mentioned, actually, and getting recognition for high performance, so somewhat interlinked. We've also spoken about giving people a voice and listening to them. And so it's really acting on feedback given, asking for feedback and acting on it. All of these things drive a greater loyalty. I would add one more thing, which is a lot of people now are very mission driven. It's not always the kind of the hardcore things, but it's very often also the softer elements of distinguishing yourself as an employer, what you stand for, and that's something that people really buy into. I would also highlight that.
Thank you for sharing that. You've got people who are curious here. All right, I think this one should go to Corina, right? How do you ensure buy-in from end users for a new tool?
So I think, first of all, it was very helpful for us to have a really robust communications plan and then to communicate and communicate. And again, like the drip feed with the health and safety information, as we were going into the launch of eduMe, we had a period of kind of 6 weeks where we were communicating regularly that it was on the way. Once we had launched, what we've then were really careful to do is to make sure that we are consistently developing and releasing regular content. So we send out 3 communications a week on a Monday, Wednesday, and a Friday, and we launch new learning content every single Friday. And so people get used to that popping up. They know that there's exactly when the content's going to come, and it's maintained the momentum. We've never had a spell of kind of more than a week or 2 weeks where people haven't had anything to engage with in it. And then the other thing that we've done is we have put in place things like competitions. We launched an eduMe awards scheme, which really drove a lot of engagement. And what we actually did for our eduMe awards is the top learners from every area of the business, they won an award. It was a sum of money, but we also donated the same sum of money to our charity that we support. So for employees, it was great because they earned themselves a little bit of extra money as a reward for their engagement, but they also got the satisfaction of seeing us make a donation to the charity on their behalf.
That's great. That's like truly building a culture of learning, right? So it kind of is something greater than just safety and compliance learning. It's a whole culture of learning.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's fantastic. All right. It looks like we probably have one. Let's do one more. Does that sound good? Okay. And I think this one is probably, again, for Corina. Let's see. Our person is asking that, or stating, smaller companies don't often have a learning and development department, and the HR training budget is often limited. What training would you prioritize for the frontline to show enough business impact that would justify ongoing and even bigger budget requests in the future?
I think that's a really good question, Fonda. I think first and foremost, you've got to focus training on those customer service metrics because they're going to increase your performance and your sales, and they're going to hit the bottom line directly. Secondly, I would then look at like your operational KPIs because that's going to help to drive your productivity. And then thirdly, I know we've talked about it, but your health and safety and your compliance, because as Jacob has said, that's where your risk is. And we're living in a world where it's not just about the litigation risk, it's also about the reputational damage as well.
Absolutely. Great summary. Folks, we are going to wrap up our Q&A at this point. Our session is coming to a close. So thank you again so much for the audience members for joining us, for Corina and Jacob for joining us. If you have further questions or would like to learn more about any of the topics you heard today, please feel free to reach out to us.